I've always known that appearances can be deceiving. Growing up in a small apartment above my parents' tiny grocery store in San Francisco's Chinatown, I watched them pour their souls into 14-hour workdays just to keep food on our table. Every morning, my mother would straighten my collar with hands worn from labor yet soft as silk, whispering, "Emma, my Tiqiang," a reminder that true worth is not measured by wealth but by character and determination. While my peers spent their evenings playing video games or watching TV, I was stocking shelves, learning the nuances of inventory management, and poring over my father's old accounting books. Numbers became my constant companions and the calculator my childhood toy. But more than equations, I absorbed the ethos of their work. Respect every customer no matter what they can afford and treat everyone like family. My father often said, "You never know their story." Their sacrifices bore fruit when I received a full scholarship to Stanford's business school. My mother sobbed when I opened my acceptance letter, and my father, for the first time in years, closed the store early. At Stanford, I worked tirelessly, channeling my parents' grit into something larger. By the time I graduated, I had developed an innovative supply chain management system that caught the attention of Genesis Tech, a rising Silicon Valley powerhouse. When their CEO, Marcus Sterling, saw my final presentation, he leaned forward with genuine admiration. "Your algorithm could change the world." We celebrated the way we always did, with dumplings and my mother's special red bean soup. Soon after, Marcus made me an offer that exceeded my wildest expectations, a senior position with substantial stock options. Yet, I surprised him when I requested to start in operations, working from the ground up, just as I had in my parents' store. "Most people want to start at the top," Marcus mused, intrigued. "How can I lead if I don't understand the foundations?" I replied. That decision led me to an unassuming morning in the company cafeteria, where, absorbed in inventory reports, I barely noticed when someone jostled my table, nearly spilling my coffee. "Oh no, I'm so sorry." I looked up to see a tall man with kind eyes and a crooked tie, fumbling to steady my cup. "I swear I'm usually more coordinated," he added with a sheepish grin. Laughing, I waved it off. No harm done. That moment led to coffee, then lunch, then dinner, and soon we were inseparable. His name was James. He worked in marketing, his creative flair a perfect counterbalance to my analytical nature. He loved hearing about my work and often remarked, "You don't just see problems, you solve them." One evening as we walked along the bay, he proposed. I said yes without hesitation. It wasn't until we began planning the wedding that I met his mother, Victoria Wilson. Their Pacific Heights mansion was a monument to old money, with its grand marble staircase and gilded decor. Victoria greeted me from the top of the stairs, scrutinizing me through designer glasses. "You work in operations?" she asked, the words dripping with barely concealed disdain. "Yes," I said evenly. "And your parents run a grocery store in Chinatown?" she whispered, glancing at her husband. "Everyone has to start somewhere," James interjected, squeezing my hand. But he said nothing more. It was my first warning. Victoria's subtle jabs became routine. Even my wedding dress, a modern design infused with traditional Chinese elements, was a point of contention. "Francis dear, wouldn't you prefer something else?" she'd say, her tone ever so polite. "This is appropriate," I replied firmly. "It honors both cultures." She pursed her lips. "I suppose it's your choice." Despite her meddling, the wedding was beautiful. My parents sat in the front row, their eyes glistening with pride, while Victoria held court with regal dignity. Monthly family dinners became tests of patience. "Emma, could you help the housekeeper clear the table? You must feel more at home in the kitchen." "James, Caroline just made partner at her law firm. Isn't that right?" "Of course, not everyone marries up." James remained silent. Again. By Christmas, Victoria announced a lavish holiday dinner, emphasizing that everyone who matters would be present. I smiled. "Yes, well, you understand family," I said lightly. She had no idea that this Christmas would challenge her preconceptions in ways she could never have imagined. At precisely 6 o'clock, we arrived at the Wilson mansion. The 3-story facade glowed with thousands of sparkling white lights, and through frosted windows, I glimpsed a dining room straight out of a luxury magazine, towering floral arrangements, gleaming crystal, and an air of opulence. "James, Emma," Victoria greeted us, her smile practiced. As guests gathered in the living room, she turned to me. "Emma, maybe you could help in the kitchen with the appetizers?" "Mom," James began, but I lightly touched his arm. "It's okay," I said smoothly. Victoria's lips curled into a smug smile. She wore an elegant designer gown, no doubt worth more than she assumed I made in a year. In the kitchen, I found Marie, the Wilsons' housekeeper of 15 years, directing a small team with the precision of a general. When she saw me, her warm smile reached her eyes. "Mrs. Emma, what are you doing here? You're a guest." "Apparently not," I replied with a wry smile. James hesitated, then gave a feeble laugh before disappearing back into the living room. I rolled up my sleeves and continued to smile, arranging the smoked salmon canapés with deliberate ease. The doorbell rang once more. And that's when everything changed. Victoria's ecstatic cries rang through the grand Wilson mansion as more guests arrived, their laughter and chatter filling the lavish halls. Among the voices, one stood out unmistakably: Caroline. Of course, James's ex-girlfriend had somehow managed to make her way onto the guest list. I exhaled softly, steeling myself for the evening ahead. Dinner time arrived, and I joined Maria, the housekeeper, in carrying the appetizers into the opulent formal dining room. The space was even grander than I had imagined. A long mahogany table, set for 24, gleamed under the glow of a crystal chandelier. Each place setting was adorned with Waterford crystal, the delicate calligraphy on the name cards a testament to Victoria's meticulous planning. I walked around the edge of the table, scanning for my name. It wasn't there. "Oh, Emma," Victoria's voice carried a syrupy sweetness, feigned concern barely masking her delight. "We're just a little crowded at the main table, but I'm sure you understand that family comes first." She gestured toward the kitchen. "You and Maria seem to get along so well, why don't you join her?" Silence fell over the room. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, others watched with quiet curiosity. Caroline, seated beside James, barely concealed a smirk behind her champagne glass. Richard, James's father, cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Maybe we could make room," he began, but Victoria cut him off with practiced ease. "Emma is accustomed to more informal settings," she said smoothly. In the kitchen, Maria wrung her hands, her face etched with worry. "Mrs. Emma, this isn't right. Let me speak to Mrs. Wilson." I forced a smile, years of navigating high-stakes negotiations keeping my expression neutral. "It's fine, Maria." My cheeks burned, but I refused to let Victoria see me falter. Instead, I pulled out my phone, sent a single text, and took a seat at the small kitchen table. Maria hesitated before offering, "At least let me fix you a plate." "Thank you, Maria, but I have urgent work to handle," I replied, opening my laptop. Major supply chain issues? The truth wasn't far from it. Marcus Sterling, my CEO at Genesis Tech, had sent over updates about disruptions in Asia. As I reviewed the data, I realized the situation was more severe than I'd anticipated, but still manageable. From the dining room, the sound of clinking glasses and laughter drifted through the door. I kept my focus on the screen, fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. Then 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Maria started to answer it, but I stopped her. "I'll get it," I said. When I opened the door, Marcus Sterling stood on the doorstep, his signature-tailored suit impeccable despite the late hour. His sharp eyes held a trace of concern. "Emma," he greeted me warmly, stepping inside. "I apologize for the interruption." Laughter carried from the dining room, Victoria's voice rising above the rest as she regaled guests with stories from James's childhood. Caroline added tidbits from their high school days. "Your Christmas dinner?" I asked, arching a brow. "The Asia situation needs your input," he said simply. Although I technically wasn't at the dinner table, I had more pressing matters to attend to. Marcus frowned. "Why aren't you in there?" I smiled faintly. "Why don't we find out together?" With that, we walked into the dining room. Conversation halted instantly. 24 heads turned in unison, confusion and curiosity painting their faces. Victoria, seated at the head of the table, stiffened before rising to her feet, her expression unreadable. Marcus surveyed the room before turning to me. Before I could respond, Victoria's voice sliced through the silence. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said with effortless poise. "The help isn't supposed to let visitors in unannounced." "Emma, you should know better." Marcus blinked. "I'm confused," he said slowly. "Why is my senior vice president of operations eating in the kitchen?" The color drained from Victoria's face. I didn't know," she stammered. "You never asked," I said evenly. A sharp gasp filled the air as Caroline's champagne flute slipped from her grasp, shattering against the hardwood floor. No one moved to clean it up. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. "But you work in operations," she finally sputtered. "I do," I said, my voice calm. Marcus interjected smoothly, "Her supply chain system is revolutionary. In fact, her husband has spoken of her accomplishments often." All eyes turned to James. He looked pale as if he might faint. As senior vice president, I chose to start at the bottom, just like my parents did in their grocery store, I continued. Marcus nodded approvingly. And speaking of which, Emma, our youngest board member, is worth more than Marcus's stock options alone. At our last meeting, Victoria collapsed into her chair. I turned to her, my gaze steady. Thank you for making my place in this family so abundantly clear, I said. It's helped me make some important decisions. James stood abruptly. Emma, wait. We need to talk about this. I agree, I said. But not tonight. I have a business to run. As I turned to leave, I paused. Oh, and Victoria? I added with a polite smile. Those dumplings you missed last month? They were a hit at our last gala. $200 per plate. Quite the success with the governor. Marcus and I stepped out into the crisp night air. As we neared his car, he glanced at me. I've been wondering how long you'd let them treat you like that. I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cold air. Sometimes it's better to let people show you who they really are, I murmured. Asia needed my attention. My life needed a new perspective. And as my mother always said, every day is a new opportunity. Tonight I had seized mine. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my private space. My phone buzzed incessantly, messages from James, Richard, even Caroline. But the one from Victoria stood out. Emma, dear, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. A knock at my office door pulled me from my thoughts. Mrs. Chen, my assistant, peeked in. Your husband is in the lobby again. Third attempt? I sighed. When James entered, he was far from his usual polished self. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his tie missing. His gaze flickered around the room, taking in the sleek office, the awards on the walls, the 93 unread texts, the 47 missed calls, and the flood of emails. Victoria alone had sent a dozen. Send him up, Sarah, I said. James stepped inside hesitantly. This has been your office for 2 years? I gestured for him to sit. Not that you ever asked. He sank into the chair, eyes downcast. I don't understand, he murmured. Why didn't you tell me? I leaned back, arms crossed. James, I said evenly. Between your mother's jabs and your silence, why did I have to? The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken words and unresolved grievances. For 2 long years, I had endured the subtle slights and overt disrespect, the quiet humiliations that had become a part of my life. Christmas dinners spent alone in the kitchen, the laughter that echoed from the dining room as James's mother made her cutting remarks about my background. I had watched, silent but seething, as Caroline was paraded before me, a not-so-subtle reminder of what James's family believed I could never be. And through it all, James had said nothing. Not a word in my defense, not a gesture of solidarity. Just silence. That silence had been deafening, a constant reminder that I was seen as less than unworthy of their respect. But I had never been ashamed of who I was. Not of my parents' grocery store, not of the hard work that had shaped me, not of the quiet strength that had carried me through those years. The shame had always been theirs, though they were too blind to see it. When I finally spoke, my voice was firm, steady, but laced with the weight of everything I had held back. For 2 years, James, I watched you laugh at your mother's jokes about my background. I watched you remain silent while she treated me as though I were beneath you. You've been ashamed of me for 2 years, or at least of what you believed I was. But I wasn't ashamed. So tell me, if you weren't ashamed, why didn't you ever ask about my work? Why didn't you come see me here? Why didn't you defend me? He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, my phone buzzed on the desk. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. I answered, my tone professional and clipped. The board approved your Asia strategy, he said. Office work. Thank you, Marcus. Finalize the timeline today. When I hung up, James was staring at me, his face pale. You report directly to Marcus Sterling? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I have for years, I replied, my tone cool. In fact, I mentioned it last Christmas when I missed your mother's party. I was in Tokyo, closing a billion-dollar deal. But you thought I was working a shift at a warehouse. The realization dawned on him slowly, the pieces falling into place. Emma, I didn't know, he stammered, his voice pleading. Give me another chance. I shook my head, the movement slow and deliberate. The issue, James, is that you only want to make amends now that you know I'm successful. What about when you believed I was just a grocery store girl? Did I not deserve respect then? The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and in it I found my answer. The door opened and Sarah stepped in, her expression uneasy. Mrs. Wilson is here, she said. And she's insistent. I nodded, and a moment later Victoria swept into the room, impeccably dressed as always, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to clear up this misunderstanding," she began, her tone saccharine. I arched an eyebrow, cutting her off before she could continue. "You mean the misunderstanding where you made me eat in the kitchen? Or the one where you spent 2 years treating me as though I were beneath you?" Her eyes darted around the room, widening as they landed on the credentials and accolades displayed on the wall. "Emma, darling," she began, her voice faltering. "I had no idea who you were. That's the root of the issue," I said bluntly. "You judged me based on my parents' grocery store. Tell me, Victoria, how much did Genesis Tech pay for my supply chain system?" She blinked, caught off guard. "I don't know," she admitted. $300 million, I said. "And that was before I even graduated. That small store taught me the value of hard work and respect. Something you still don't understand?" As I opened my laptop, an email from my lawyer caught my eye. "James," I said, my voice steady, "you've given me plenty of chances. I'm filing for divorce." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "You can't. Think of James's future." "I am thinking of mine," I replied, standing. "The prenup you insisted on protects my assets as much as his. And the Pacific Heights mansion I bought last year? Check the property records. While you allowed your mother to denigrate me, I was building something real." I pressed a button on my desk and Sarah reappeared. "Escort Mrs. Wilson out," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. I turned to James. "You have until Friday to move your belongings to your parents' house." He stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Emma, imagine what people will say when security shows up." "They'll say what I should have said years ago," I replied. "Respect isn't purchased with money. Treating people with dignity costs nothing." I turned to face him fully, my gaze steady. "Your mother tried to make me feel small for years, but all she managed to do was make me realize how small she is." After they left, I stood by the window watching the fog roll over the bay. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from my mother. I smiled, a sense of peace settling over me. Every day is a new opportunity, I thought, and I began drafting a press release about Genesis Tech's latest triumph. A deal that would send the stock price soaring to a record high. 6 months later, as I closed another quarterly report, the divorce was final, the house sold, and Victoria had a new cautionary tale for her bridge club. But none of it mattered anymore. Sarah knocked on the door, her voice cheerful. "Mrs. Chin, your parents are here for lunch." I closed my laptop, a smile spreading across my face. Success, I realized, isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. The best retaliation isn't served cold in a kitchen, surrounded by those who fail to see your worth. It's served in a corner office, surrounded by those who have recognized your value all along.